I'll try to be brief. The rumor that I speak forever is wrong. It only seems like that. Let me say repeat something I said at lunch. First, I thank Kim Shepley for organizing this, and as well Steve and Robbie George for being her worthy assistants in this. And I'm doubly glad to be here, not only to return home, but as a few of you know, I gave a talk here in September at Robbie's invitation on constitutional problems with George Bush's policies. And I argued that Bush's policies were undermining, in a general way and in specific ways, violating the Constitution.
Speak closely into the mic.
All right. So someone said after the lecture that I would be punished for that, and I laughed, knowing that I said, what can anybody do to me? I mean, I'm old, I'm retired, stock market crash may do me in, but that's about it. And I found the person was right. I tried to get on the plane yesterday morning, and I was stopped at the gate. I mean, when I tried to check in. I am on the list of terrorists. I'm a retired colonel in the Marine Corps. In my mad youth, I did such things. And I was wounded in the war, and now I criticized George Bush, so now I am a known terrorist. A lot of students from Princeton would say it's about time. But in any event, fortunately Albuquerque is a military town, and I had my Marine ID card, and the clerk was kind enough to go fight for me, put on my behalf, that is, and got me on the plane. I'm not sure I'll be able to get back. You people may be saddled with me for the rest of my life. Well, let me say that I heartily endorse all positive comments the panel made. They were brilliant. I couldn't do it better myself, although I might try. But let me respond to some of the issues. And because I say in the book, and I really meant it, my purpose was to incite, not to pontificate. And this is just what I wanted people to argue. And let me go sort of seriatim, though. If I had some time, if we did this tomorrow, I might work out something coherent. But quickly, Mark Brandon's comments, which are well taken. I do worry about the problems of plurality, social and religious pluralism, and uniformity. I really do. And civic education can easily degenerate into political indoctrination. But if one reads what I said also that political indoctrination for political education for constitutional democracy, and here I echo Sot Barber, is potentially subversive. Because the purpose of political education in constitutional democracy is to teach people to think about public problems, to reason about them, and possibly to disagree fundamentally with not only what government does in specific cases, but about the nature of the political order. Perhaps the constitutional order is wrong. One of the distinctions I try to make in the book, which a lot of people don't like, so be it, is between constitutionism, that is constitution with an ISM on the end, which simply means loyalty to a constitution, particular constitution, and constitutionalism, which means loyalty to a set of ideas concerning human dignity, limited but effective government. And these are quite different. Finally, it was brought home to me after a number of conferences in Latin America where people who were minions of Augusto Pinochet were defending his oppressive regime as being constitutional because it did conform to their written constitution. No question. They were right. But that wasn't constitutionalism in my way. It was constitutionism. I mean, it was a constitutional text that justified, I mean, he wrote it, or his people wrote it, his kind of arbitrary authoritarian rule. So that political indoctrination in a constitutional democracy should not be political indoctrination for this particular constitution, whatever it is. It should be to certain other general principles, and most of all, dependence on reason. And as Sot Barber has pointed out, when you depend on reason, you may be subversive of the authority of the people who are in charge, including the teachers. As any of you who've had teenage children who are bright know, they are quite good at challenging your authority and, damn them, using your words and arguments, which they think is effective but only succeeded in angering me. Okay, I agree with Mark on these points. And about war, I would disagree with him on one point. I didn't say that democracies, constitutional democracies, fight fewer wars. I quoted a number of political scientists as saying this and tried to show that what they said wasn't exactly true, although it was. But what I did agree with them is that mature constitutional democracies are less likely to fight one another, which is not to say they don't fight other countries. I mean, we haven't had a war with Canada or France or Belgium or Britain or Switzerland or Italy or in a long, well, Italy, but not since World War II. I mean, these are just rare if you think about mature constitutional democracies fighting one another. They fight other people all the time. Mark is right about that. Okay. Let me then turn to Jim Fleming's remarks. Again, he's got a very good point about maintenance sometimes looks like more tinkering than it does adaptation. I originally had a series of chapters on constitutional change, and the book was divided into 3 parts: constitutional construction, constitutional maintenance, and constitutional change. But the more I thought about it, it seemed to me that constitutional maintenance and constitutional change just bled into one another. The only way to maintain a constitutional order is to change it. The world changes. I mean, if we can use general concepts such as due process of law, divided power, and keep them from century unto century. But if we keep the specific notions that people had of what was due process, what was human dignity, and how to protect it in one century, and try to get that exact same model 3 centuries later, we're going to be in trouble often. And that we may have to change. And so too with constitutional interpretation. I try not to endorse any special theory of constitutional interpretation, but I come very close to purpose of interpretation. The idea of always interpreting a constitution as having certain purposes, and with Sot's point, again, I followed the German Constitutional Court that said a constitutional text may contain provisions that are somewhat incompatible and even contradict one another. And what do? The Constitutional Court then followed Madison and Federalist 37, 40, and 45 and said, you look to what's important, most important, and you arrange a hierarchy. If this is the end, the aim, the ultimate purpose, then you interpret the others to be working toward that end. And if the language is contradictory, so be it. The lesser falls to the greater, and the purpose is more important than the means. I think that's very good. It's not easy, and one of the reasons I endorse departmentalism, the notion that legislators, executives, and judges, and the people have an important role to play in constitutional interpretation, is if you give to one branch of government, one person, the sole authority to say what the Constitution, again, I should back up and say I mean by the Constitution, not simply the text, but the constitutional order, the ideas on which the constitutional text is based, the traditions around that have developed around this this document, including many interpretations such as Brown versus Board in the school segregation cases, Lincoln's statement at the beginning of the Civil War, so forth. I mean, those are part of the American, and the Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident. Those are part of the Constitution, I think, and I won't make it here, but I could make an argument about that. But if you give one person, one institution, one branch of government authority to say what that order means and what its power is and what everybody else's power is, you've set up a dictatorship, in effect, if it's strong enough to carry it out. I mean, that's one of the saving advantages of judicial review. Judges can't run down from the bench and begin using their gavels on other people who disobey or ignore their opinions.
Don't give Scalia any ideas.
Yes. Nino and I are old friends. And we have sometimes been together for more than 10 minutes without yelling at each other and shaking our fingers at each other. I can't remember when exactly, but I'm sure there have been some occasions. All right. A really serious question is how, and as one of the panelists, I think it was Jim Fleming, raised, what's the institutional framework to carry out this kind of dialogue among people, Congress, or not Congress necessarily, a legislature, executive officials, and judges? I don't know of any exact one, but I was able to cite some examples, not of each branch doing its own thing, but, for example, of abortion in Germany, where the Constitutional Court declared the first abortion statute unconstitutional. So the Parliament got back together and drafted a new law which didn't meet the court all the way, but resolved part of the disagreement. And the court then sustained it. You had a dialogue, and there were elections in the meantime. And through Donald Comer's at Notre Dame, I met the president of the German Constitutional Court, who said, well, the Parliament made rational arguments. It's easier in a parliamentary system where you have a group of political leaders who do most of the talk rather than a bevy of 200 speeches. And he said, I read all that. He says, I think we probably were partially wrong in the first opinion. So it was easier for him to change his mind. He then changed. And you had a similar process in Ireland with, by the way, a couple of referenda in which the people were asked to express their opinions intervening. Those are unwieldy. How can we duplicate them? I don't know. And that is a practical problem. But I think any time we say, we allow the Supreme Court to be the total determinant of American policy, or the German Constitutional Court to be the sole determinant of what the German Constitution says, or if we even allow a president who says, I am the decider, and that ends all constitutional discussion, we're in real trouble. Or whatever country that does that is in real trouble. I don't have the exact machinery in mind. Jim said, I've got some other books to write. I agree. I do have some other books to write, and they're all novels. My wife, when she was alive, never criticized my spending time on scholarly books, though on occasion she did, as I said in the preface, allude to certain questions of rational choice to spend time with these books that would probably earn $50 a year as opposed to a novel which might earn $500,000 a year. She raised this gently. I got the point. I have some comments on Jeff Toulis's question, but I really can't read them. But generations of Princeton students said that I had lots of comments on their papers, and they couldn't read them either. I'm surprised Keith Whittington could. I can't read what I said, but that's okay. I should have a general comment here that I would have done at the beginning had I been making rational choices. And that is, the panel was talking about politicizing in politics. I use the word politics in a very limited sense in this book, and I try to in real life, though I don't always succeed. And that is, I like to use it in Aristotle's sense. Politics is concerned with fashioning and maintaining a political system that enables citizens to live good lives. And he said politics was the master art. I don't refer to it as petty jobbery of giving the Republicans an advantage or carrying an advantage over Clinton and or Obama, et cetera, anything like that. I mean, what policies do you really consider to be, using reason again, not just personal interest, et cetera, what policies will best enable citizens of any country to live a good life? And that's always hotly contested, of course. And I don't mean it's easy. I do mean, when I say politicize, I mean try to bring people to think about problems of government, problems of public policy in that sense. How can you live with this policy? What will the effects be? And of course, they're all guesses. I mean, we operate under what I think economists call limited choice, and also very restricted and very imperfect knowledge. So we have to make guesses, and the best we can do is to sit, study, reason, and try to make decisions that we can give good and convincing reasons for. And that ain't easy. I mean, it's certainly not easy in any field, even when you're grading student papers. That can be very difficult. Keith Whittington, who acknowledges that we differ, and we do, and hopes that I may someday reform. I'm afraid it's too late, but I hope someday he too may see the light. But he raised very good questions of constitutional forgetfulness, constitutional neglect, and constitutional contestation. We do often forget about what the Constitution, again in the general sense of the constitutional order, the values, the political values in Aristotle's sense that we endorse, what a specific text and so forth requires. We do often neglect them, and they're almost always contested. I mean, if we just restrict ourselves to the text, what does due process of law mean? I mean, lawyers will give us definitions, but the difficulty with that is if you go to the next lawyer, he'll give you a different definition, and the same with judges, et cetera, et cetera. We think we know what it means. We have a general understanding, but specifically we will differ. And constitutional neglect is more common, alas, than we'd like to think, I am sure. I remember once I was interviewing the Minister of Finance of the Irish government, who later became Prime Minister. And he was proposing a policy, and I said, Mr. Minister, I had the copy of the Irish constitutional text. The constitutional text specifically forbids that. He leaned back and looked at me. He says, the Constitution is a bloody nuisance. Fortunately, the rest of Parliament disagreed, and his proposal never saw the light of day. The Prime Minister had more sense and didn't allow it to come to a vote. But these are serious problems. And I think one of the ways you cope with them, I don't know that there's certainly no perfect way, and I don't even know if this is an effective way, but one of the ways is the business that William brought up. Public arguments. And not simply public arguments by senators and Congress, people of Congress and attorneys general and presidents and judges and so forth. But the rest of us have an obligation. Citizens, journalists, I mean, even professors have been known to have political opinions and to write books and articles. And I think it's a civic duty that we have as citizens, first to be informed. I mean, the worst thing in the world is to have, a huge mass of people. After my last talk here, one man came up and said, how can you justify the Federal Reserve System? Well, I hadn't been talking about the Federal Reserve System at all. and he said, look, the Constitution forbids making anything but gold and silver legal tender. And, well, if you read the clause, it says no state shall. He said, well, doesn't that mean the federal government too? No. No. But I mean, we have a duty to be informed and then to speak. I mean, to reason, to think. And one nice thing about elected public officials is whether they want to or not, unless they're very old and don't plan to run for re-election, they have to listen. They may not change their minds, but they have to listen. And so that would be, my not response, but that is the way I try to address this problem. And as I said at lunch today to some of the people, you can find lots of errors in this book. I got my first copy, on Tuesday afternoon. I had gotten a big box of books from Johns Hopkins University Press, and I didn't wait to open them because I'd had to index the thing in August, and my wife was sick, and I didn't have time to, but I thought I'd better read this. So about 2 weeks ago, I opened the big box of books, and there I had a nice box of books entitled Venetians in Constantinople, which was a minimum amount of help to prepare for this. And I promised a copy to Sot Barber, though. And I got on the phone with people at Johns Hopkins University. And it took me a week before they understood I didn't have any copies. And they finally sent me one on Tuesday. So I read it on the airplane. And as, again, I repeat myself from lunch, reading it over, I was impressed with two things. One, I often said, gee, I didn't know I knew that. And the other was, paraphrasing Robert H. Jackson's remark, one of his remarks from the bench, when somebody quoted one of his former opinions, he said, I'm amazed that a man of my intelligence would have made such an error. So that if you have, I mean, there are lots of criticisms I could make. I can assure you I can make more and not necessarily better, but nastier criticisms than the rest of it. But that's not the point of the book. The thing that I want to do, and I'm so pleased with Kim's organization and with the panelists, is I've said I wanted to incite, not to pontificate. And I think I incited. And my effort here is not to pour water on the incitement, but to say, to quote our glorious leader, sure that victory is here, bring it on.
Okay. And in that spirit, we have... and in that spirit, having said bring it on rather than mission accomplished, we have some additional time for questions, provocations. I was going to ask a question, since it is one of the themes of the book is a poll with constitutionalism, or just everybody grinds their own axes. So constitutionalism and democracy and a blend. But as you talk about it too, I mean, a lot of constitutionalism is about sort of realizing democracy, yes. and a terrific amount of what the document is about and what its structure is about and what constitutional maintenance is about is not so much about promoting values that are in tension with democracy, but seem to be about the project of collective self-governance, properly understood and realized, and so on.
And limited.
And limited, but limited in the name of what? I mean, to some degree, of course, limited in the name of, sometimes in the name of liberty and so on, but to some degree the limits themselves may be democracy enhancing. So putting some things off the agenda may be necessary to permit us to engage in collective self-governance across a range of things that we can actually have cooperative relations on, putting questions of religious truth off the agenda and so on. And freedom of the press, freedom of association, even privacy rights allow people to sort of form their views without fear, to form their views with confidence and to criticize. And so I do wonder whether sometimes and I don't think this is true of the substance of the book, but sometimes the kind of the thematic framework suggests a tension when in fact limitations and constraints from one point of view are enabling from another point of view, and enabling with respect to the project of self-government being a complicated project in a nation so large and so diverse.
I think that's right, but I think your concept of democracy is a British, American, Western European concept. I mean, one of the most interesting people I met was the Minister of Defense of Vietnam after the war. And he was saying he didn't understand constitutionalism at all. What was I talking about? And I explained just this. It is limiting government, even government that represents the people, because the people may want to restrict others, and they can restrict others not easily, but it's certainly possible, without restricting themselves. I grew up in the Deep South in the 1930s. I was born in the 20s, but I won't mention that. But in the 30s, where if you'd had a plebiscite, segregation would have won, and in fact did win through the 50s. If you'd said, are blacks inferior to whites, that would have been an easy question. You needed some restraints on this version of democracy. And the South white South, gradually, begrudgingly, obstinately, finally accepted what would be your definition of mine. If one would accept a democratic government as a definition of democracy, not ruled by the people, but ruled by the people with limitations and respect for others somehow institutionally enforced, then I think we could talk about democracy. But that's not what democracy has meant in most places at most time. You remember most times. Was it was it Dicey, the English legal commentator, who said Parliament can do anything it wants except make a man a woman? And now Danish surgeons cured that defect about a century later. But and the British Parliament did. I mean, they disenfranchised the Irish, took away their right to property, etc. And it was a democratically elected Parliament. I think it's conceptually useful to separate the notion of democracy and constitutionalism, with constitutionalism meaning that there are certain rights that cannot be infringed, that government is limited, there are certain principles that government must follow, and have institutional means set up to enforce those commands. Felix Frankfurter, who never really believed in judicial review, used to say the seared conscience of the citizenry was the only sure barrier. And he was right. It's the only sure barrier, but it's not the only barrier, obviously. Especially for one who grows in the American political system or lives in the American political system, where the Senate, you get 2 votes for Vermont and 2 votes for California. I mean, that's it always struck me as odd that our president said that Iraq had a democratic system of government when a majority elected the parliament, and he equated democracy with majority rule when he himself lost the election of 2000. The majority voted against him, but that was perfectly, shouldn't say it's perfectly all right, perfectly legitimate, because that's the way the American political system operates. It gives to minorities, which initially were thought of as geographic as well as much more so than ethnic, religious, etc., not a veto, but an extra strong voice in controlling public policy. If we could have, I think Robert Dahl, who taught at Yale for centuries, was absolutely right, that a good political culture would probably protect individual rights, give us limited government more effectively than any system of separated powers competing for separate institutions competing for shared powers. And that's right, except the only place you're going to get that possibly is in heaven, and I've understood God doesn't believe in the separation of powers. I mean, that at least, yes.
So Maurizio?
I wish to publicly thank you for what you told me 20 years ago, including the remarkable piece of knowledge about English language. Being an Italian is not that simple. You explained to me that English is the only language in the world where Yeah. That was your teaching. I shall never forget.
Yeah.
But I was also to thank you for clarification you have offered us tonight on an issue that for me is quite important, almost as important as getting the English language right. And it has to do with the distinction that it often gets neglected in current debates between the idea that in a democracy, the people is the sovereign but is not omnipotent. This is a distinction that came out very nicely. And this, not to be omnipotent, means that there are some issues on which citizens directly are not the best to invite people to express their views. One is the Constitution. I just came back from Italy. I spent here a year, and I was busy when I was not in the library doing two things. One was to help to defeat Berlusconi's government, Berlusconi, whom your president is so fond of. The other was to be actively engaged in the referendum on the Constitution in June 26. Now I want to offer to your meditation and other friends in the room consideration the fact that in that campaign, the two leaders who were most vociferous and most resolute to say the citizens ought to judge the Constitution, they have to evaluate the new Constitution. The proposed reformed Constitution by the Berlusconi government meant a change of 53 articles over 139. So it was a new Constitution. They were so vehement about having the people voting over 53 new articles. And you know, our obvious reservation was that citizens don't know, simply don't know the articles they are voting for. One thing is to submit to the citizens through a referendum one article, 1, 2, on consistent or similar connected issues, but a new constitution to be approved directly through a referendum by the people was exactly what people like Berlusconi, who is a populist and know how to seduce the people, wanted, and Mr. Fini wanted. Mr. Fini, until 1992, believed that the greatest Italian statesman was Benito Mussolini.
Yeah, I believe that citizens have an important role to interpret the Constitution and to hold responsible other public officials who more overtly interpret. But I do think there are limits. I couldn't help but thinking of the way that elections are carried on where I now live, New Mexico. It has what people call the jungle ballot. At any general election, there are at least 4 or 5 pages, and often 10 pages. Everybody is elected in New Mexico. The dog catcher, the dog catcher's assistant. The only statewide officials who are, let me back up. The governor is elected in the state, but so is the lieutenant governor. So's the attorney general. So are every member of the so-called cabinet of the governor. So you can end up with a Republican governor as a Democratic attorney general, and you can get this mishmash, and the result is nobody can govern, which is just what a lot of people want. I mean, it may be, since nobody trusts government in New Mexico, and with good reason. One of my friends who had a large corporation there said, I can buy any public official in New Mexico for $100. Said, I moved to New York and I can't afford them. This is ridiculous. What I can see is, I hate to be parochial, but I think the American idea in 1787 of having the people elect a convention that would make more sense, because who could debate You just don't have time to do this. And I'll bet of the people who proposed those 53 articles, if there were 100 of them, I'll bet not 2 of them had read the entire 53. So, yeah, sorry.
Too many elections is no good for democracy. Tim?
Yes.
This is a question about running your book sort of in reverse, which is the book talks about how to constitute a constitutional democracy in your sense, and how to maintain a constitutional democracy in all the senses we've been discussing. But I was interested in your distinction between constitutionism and constitutionalism. And I wonder what you want to say about how a country that's fallen into constitutionism gets back to constitutionalism, and what those debates look like, in your view.
Well, the short answer, again, the smart aleck answer, is with great difficulty. But the real answer is, if I use an example, Chile. The people there, the outs, were smart enough to use Pinochet's constitution and constitutionism to drive him out of office. He had prescribed an election, elections periodically. He won the first, hands down, and he lost the second. And there he was. By the terms of his own constitution, his constitutionalism, he had to get out. And I might also add that it took a stroke of great luck, because when he realized he'd lost the election, he called out the troops in the streets of Santiago. And so my friends in a certain non-existent agency in the American embassy told me that they were afraid he was going to declare the elections void. But he was foiled by the fact that he had a junta. He had been the commanding general of the Army. He had a Navy admiral and the commanding general of the Air Force. Being a somewhat less developed country, Chile did not have a Marine Corps. So on the steps of the palace, a reporter stuck a microphone in the face of the commanding general of the Air Force and asked what he thought. Well, the Air Force had felt it had gotten the short end of the budgetary stick because Pinochet was rewarding the Army. And he said, "We've been beaten." That made it very difficult for Pinochet to contest the election, or to void the election, and also let him know that people in his own junta were disappointed in his regime, and that even if he did void the election, he was going to be in trouble. I don't know how you duplicate that. I mean, the cleverness of the opposition. Chile had a number of political parties, not as many as Italy, or Italy used to have, but a lot. And they got together about 3 months before the election and agreed that they would put aside their differences as best they could and agree on 1 or 2 sets of candidates. They would stop splitting so that each party got 10% of the votes. They would get together and have a unified front to get rid of Pinochet. And they did. That required a lot of skill. And I try to say time and again in the book, creating and maintaining and changing a constitutional democracy requires a lot of work from a lot of intelligent, dedicated, and shrewd, and maybe even slick people. And that was required there. Constitutional democracies don't come into existence. They don't stay in existence. I mean, these are unnatural organizations. Maybe not contrary to nature, but they're not, you don't find them, if you look around. In Locke's world, pre-social contract, you wouldn't find a lot of those animals wandering around. So we have to create them. We have to maintain them. And a lot of people have to work in very determined ways. And of course in Chile it was all the more difficult because Pinochet outlawed any political party that he thought was a grievous threat. Article 8 of his constitutional text provided him with authority to do this. And of course Pinochet had this lovely practice of simply having opponents disappear. Gone. This lady had a question about republicanism, I think.
Thank you. Well, first of all, congratulations on writing the book. That's wonderful. I don't have the book yet, but I hope to get it. What I don't understand is Ben Franklin said we are a republic if you can keep it. So I just wondered why you say constitutional democracy and not republic.
Because the word republic and democracy and have become merged. Republic, I think, historically meant a political regime in which the people, rather than a king or hereditary prince of some sort, ruled. And then, I think you're right, the original American constitutional text is much more Republican than democratic. Senate's not elected, president's not directly elected, still isn't, judges weren't elected. Only one branch of one of the three arms of government was popularly elected. And even that by a restricted franchise. No women, no blacks, no Indians, etc. Very few blacks, not no blacks, that's not true. In parts of New England, black people did have the ballot. Okay, but the Constitution became much more democratized, partially through amendments, but more practically through simple political change. I mean, before is it the 19th, my wife, her hair, she'd never forgive me, is it the 19th Amendment that gave women, or acknowledged in women the right to vote? I think it was that right? Well, when the amendment was finally adopted, almost every state allowed women to vote. So the amendment was important in that it legitimized what was real and maybe set it in stone, but it didn't, it wasn't that the change came from the states, from the people. And I think the reason that people use the term democratic rather than republican to refer to the American system of government now is just that historically the word republic has almost lost its meaning. It's too bad. It's a good word. But now people think, well, you mean a democratic government. Well, initially you didn't. No, you didn't. I mean, neither you nor I was there, although people sometimes claim I was. But that's why Keith and I can argue about originalism, because I was there. I knew what those people said.
Well, you're an original, and no one will dispute that. I want to thank those guests who have come from out of town for the previous panel. I want to thank Kim Shepley and Judy Rivkin and others for getting this together. I'm going to call an end to this part of the day, but we have some beverages, adult beverages and otherwise. We have some books, and we're going to have a bit of a reception by way of welcoming Walter back and congratulating him and us for the gift of this wonderful book. And also I'll finally say that this is a kind of warm-up for another conference we're going to do next year on the themes of the book here in Princeton, either in the fall or the spring, and on the practical issues and agenda that is generated and how we can think more taking and running with the mandate of this book about problems of constitutional maintenance and improvement and better realizing its aspirations. So we'll regroup with Walter at some point next year, and in the meantime, let us thank Walter and for giving us this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you.
And just to reinforce what Steve said and to let you know what comes next, some of you may have noticed a stack of books has miraculously appeared on this table. Princeton University Press has agreed to order some books for people. We wish we could give them away, but you need to buy them. But Walter said he would sign them. And so if you would like to read the book, if your curiosity has been piqued, they're there. There are refreshments, including some wine, in the back of the room. And now is the moment for everybody to meet who else came and for everyone to have a chance to talk to Walter and the panelists. I want to say that no event like this happens without a lot of work behind the scenes. And this time, Judy Rivkin has done just an absolutely terrific job. She works normally with the Madison program. We've adopted her into LAPA these last couple of weeks, and Judy's really set up this event in a fine fashion, ably assisted by Cindy Schoenig, and the whole event wouldn't happen without them. So let me thank them and also Walter for making the whole event possible.
If I may say one thing, I said this at lunch. Judy Rivkin is a Hebrew term which translates into English as she who makes things happen at Princeton.